I'm back with part 5 of Caste, the origins of our discontent, starting today with chapter 7. Through the fog of Delhi to the parallels in India and America. The flight to India landed in a great veil that hid the terminal and its tower at the international airport in Delhi. It was January 2018, my first moments on the subcontinent. The pilot searched for a jetway through the drapery of mist. It was 2 in the morning, and it was as if we had landed in a steam kettle, were, were still airborne in a cloud, the night air pressing against cabin windows, and we could see nothing of the ground. I had not heard of rain in the forecast and was fascinated by this supernatural fog in the middle of the night until I realized that it was not fog at all, but smoke from coal plants, cars, and burning stubble trapped in the stagnant wind. The pollution was a shroud at first to seeing India as it truly was. At daybreak, the sun pushed through the haze, and once I connected with my hosts, I raced along with them to cross an intersection, an open stretch of asphalt with cars hurtling in every direction with no lanes or speed limits. We made our way along the side streets to the conference where we were attending. I saw the wayside altars and mushroom temples with their garlands and silk flowers to the Hindu deities at the base of the sacred fig trees. There, commuters can pause for reflection as they head to work or an exam or a doctor's visit. The sidewalk shrines seemed exotic to me until I thought of the American ritual of a spontaneous altars of flowers and balloons at the site of something very different, at the site of an accident or a tragedy. As for the young woman killed at the infamous rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, just months before, both reflect a human desire to connect with and honor something or someone beyond ourselves. The United States and India are profoundly different from each other in culture, technology, economic, and ethnic makeup. And yet, many generations ago, these two great lands paralleled each other, both protected by oceans and ruled for a time by the British, fertile and coveted. Both adopted social hierarchies and abide great chasms between the highest and the lowest in their respective lands. Both were conquered by people said to be Aryans arriving, and in one case from across the Atlantic Ocean, in the other just from the north. Those deemed lowest in each country would serve those deemed highest. The younger country, the United States, would become the most powerful democracy on earth. The older country, India, the largest. Their respective hierarchies are profoundly different, and yet, as if operating from the same instruction manual translated to fit their distinctive cultures, both countries adopted similar methods of maintaining rigid lines of demarcation and protocols. Both countries kept their dominant caste separate, apart and above those deemed lower. Both exiled their indigenous peoples, the Advasi in India, the Native Americans in the United States, to remote lands and and to the unseen margins of society. Both countries enacted a fretwork of laws to chain the lowliest group, Dalits in India and African Americans in the United States, to the bottom, using terror and force to keep them there. Perhaps only the Jews have as long a history of suffering from discrimination as the Dalits, wrote the Dalit journalist V.T. Rashikar. However, when we consider the nature of the suffering endured by the Dalits, it is only the African American parallel of enslavement, apartheid, and forced assimilation that comes to mind. Both countries have since abolished the formal laws that defined their caste systems. The United States in a series of civil rights laws in the 1960s, and India decades before in the 1940s. But both caste systems live on in hearts and habits, institutions and infrastructures. Both countries still live with the residue of codes that prevailed for far longer than they have not. This description of case history from the 2017 Indian book, Ground Down by Growth, could be said of the American case system with only a few word changes as noted by parentheses. Quote, the colonial powers officially abolished slavery in India, the United States, in 1843 and in 1865, respectively. But this simply led to the transformation into bondage through relations of debt, what has been called debt peonage by scholars. In both countries, and at the same time, the lowest caste toiled for their masters. African Americans in the tobacco fields along the Chesapeake or in the cotton fields of Mississippi. Dalits plucking tea from Kerala and cotton from Nandurbar. Both worked as enslaved people and later for the right to live on the land that they were farming. African Americans in the system of sharecropping, Dalits in the Indian equivalent known as Saldari, both still confined to their fixed roles at the bottom of their respective worlds. Both occupy the lowest positions on the status hierarchies in their societies, wrote Harvard political scientist Sidney Verba and his colleagues in the study of Dalits and African Americans. Both have been particularly singled out from other groups based on characteristics ascribed to them. While doors have opened to the subordinated case in India and in America in the decades since discrimination was officially prohibited, the same spasms of resistance have afflicted both countries. What is called affirmative action in the United States is called reservations in India, and they are equally unpopular with the upper caste in both countries. Language tracking in lockstep, while complaints of reverse discrimination in one and reverse uh, chaseism in the other. There are many overarching similarities, but they are not the same in how they are structured to operate. The American system was founded as a primarily two-tiered hierarchy with its contours defined by the uppermost group, those identified as whites, and by the subordinate group, those identified as black, with immigrants from outside of Europe forming blurred middle case that sought to adjust themselves within a bipolar structure. The Indian case system, by contrast, is an elaborate fretwork of thousands of subcases, or jatis, correlated to region and village, which fall under the four main varnas: Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, and the excluded fifth known as untouchables or Dalits. And it's further complicated by non Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, and Christians who are outside of the caste system but have incorporated themselves into the workings of the country, and while eschewing rigid caste, may or may not have informal rankings among themselves and in relation to the Varnas. Unlike the United States, which primarily uses physical features to tell the caste apart, in India, it is people's surnames that may most readily convey their caste. Dalit names are generally contemptible in meaning, referring to the humble or dirty work they are relegated to, while the Brahmins carry the names of the gods. Generally, you must know the significance of the name, learn the occupation of their forefathers, and perhaps know their village or their place in the village to ascertain their caste. But after centuries of forced submission and and en route marriage. They may also be identified by their bearings, accents, and clothing, all in which over the centuries were required to be lowly, menial, as well as a tendency to be darker than uppercase people, though not always. The Indian caste system is said to be stable and unquestioned by those within it, bound as it is by religion and in the Hindu of belief in reincarnation, the belief that one lives out in his life the karma of the previous ones, suffers the punishments, and reaps the rewards of one's deeds in a past life, and that the more keenly one follows the rules for the caste they were born to, the higher their station will be in the next life. Some observers say that this is what distinguishes the Indian caste system from any other, that people in the lowest caste accept their lot, that it is fixed and unbending. The Dalits live out their karma decreed by the gods and do their lowly work without complaint, knowing not to dream of anything more. In order to survive, some people in the subordinated caste may learn and believe that resistance is futile. But this condescending view disregards generations of resistance, as well as the work of Ambedkar and the reformer Jyotiba Phule before him. It was also wrongly assumed of enslaved Africans, and it disregards a fundamental truth of the species that all human beings want to be free. The Dalits were no more contented with their lot than anyone would be. In a caste system, conflating compliance with approval can be dehumanizing in itself. Many Dalits looked out beyond their homeland, surveyed the oppressed people all over the world, and identified the people closest to their lamentations. They recognized a shared fate with African Americans, few of whom would have known of the suffering of the Dalits. Some Dalits felt so strong a kinship with one wing of the American civil rights movement and had followed it so closely that in the 1970s they created the Dalit Panthers, inspired by the Black Panther Party. A few years ago, a group of African American professors made a trip to a rural village in Uttar Pradesh, India. There, hundreds of villagers from the lowliest subcaste, the scavengers, came together for a ceremony to welcome the Americans. The villagers sang Dalit liberation songs for the occasions. Then they turned to their American guests and invited them to sing a liberation song of their own. A law professor from Indiana University, Kenneth Smith, began a song that the civil rights marchers sang in Birmingham and Selma before they faced sheriff's dogs and water hoses. As he reached the refrain, the Dalit host joined in and began to sing with their American counterparts. Across the oceans, they well knew the words to We Shall Overcome. Chapter 8, The Nazis and the Acceleration of Caste. This is June 1934, Berlin. Excuse me. In the early stages of the Third Reich, before the world could imagine the horrors to come, a committee of Nazi bureaucrats met to weigh the options for imposing a rigid new hierarchy, one that would isolate Jewish people from Aryans now that the Nazis had taken control. The men summoned in the late spring of 1934 were not, at that time, planning, nor in a position to plan, extermination. That would come years later at a chillingly bloodless and cataclysmic meeting in Wannsee, deeper into a world war that had not yet begun. On this day, June 5, 1934, they were there to debate the legal framework for an Aryan nation, to turn ideology into law, and were now anxious to discuss the findings of their research into how other countries protected racial purity from the taint of the disfavored. They sat down for a closed door session in the Reich capital that day and considered it serious enough to bring a stenographer to record the proceeding and produce a transcript. As they settled into their chairs to hash out what would eventually become the Nuremberg Laws, the first topic on the agenda was the United States and what they could learn from it. The man chairing the meeting, Franz Gutner, the Reich Minister of Justice, introduced a memorandum in the opening minutes detailing the ministry's investigation into how the United States managed its marginalized groups and guarded its ruling white citizenry. The 17 legal scholars and functionaries went back and forth over American purity laws governing intermarriage and immigration. In debating how to institutionalize racism in the Third Reich, wrote the Yale legal historian James Whitman, they began by asking how the Americans did it. The Nazis needed no outsiders to plant the seeds of hatred within them. But in the early years of the regime, when they still had a stake in the appearance of legitimacy and the hope for foreign investment, they were seeking legal prototypes for the caste system they were building. They were looking to move quickly with their plans for racial separation and purity, and knew that the United States was centuries ahead of them with its anti-miscegenation statutes and race-based immigration bans. For us Germans, it is especially important to know and see how one of the biggest states in the world with Nordic stock already has race legislation, which is quite comparable to that of the German Reich. The German press agency Deutsche Presidente wrote as the Nazis were solidifying their grip on the country. Western Europeans had long been aware of the American paradox of proclaiming liberty for all men while holding subsets of its citizenry in near total subjugation. The French writer Alexis de Tocqueville toured antebellum America in the 1830s and observed that only the surface of American society is covered with a layer of democratic paint. Germany well understood the United States' fixation on race purity and eugenics and pseudoscience of grading humans by presumed group superiority. Many leading Americans had joined the eugenics movement of the early 20th century, including the inventor Alexander Graham Bell, the auto magnate Henry Ford, and Charles W. Eliot, the president of Harvard University. During the First World War, the German Society for Racial Hygiene applauded the dedication with its American sponsors' research in the field of racial hygiene and with which they translate theoretical knowledge into practice. The Nazis had been especially taken with the militant race theories of two widely known American eugenicists, Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant. Both were men of privilege, born and raised in the North and educated in the Ivy League. Both built their now discredited reputations on hate ideology that devised a crude ranking of European stock that declared Eastern and Southern Europeans inferior to the Nordics and advocated for the exclusion and elimination of races that deemed threats to Nordic racial purity, foremost among them Jews and Negroes. Negroes are in quotes because there's no such thing as Negro land. Okay. A racial slur that the Nazis adopted in their campaign to dehumanize Jews and other non-Aryans, the word Untermensch, meaning subhuman, came to them from the New England eugenicist Lothrop started. A 1922 book he wrote carried the subtitle, The Menace of the Underman, which translated into Untermenschen in the German edition. The Nazis took the word as their own and would most become associated with it. They made Stoddard's book on white supremacy a standard text in the Reich school curriculum and accorded him a private audience with the purposely remote Adolf Hitler at the Reich Chancellery in December in 1939. Well into World War II, Stoddard sat in on Nazi sterilization trials and commended the Nazis for weeding out the worst strains of the Germanic stock in a scientific and truly humanitarian way. He lamented, though, that, if anything, their judgments were almost too conservative. Whoa. Madison Grant, a leading eugenicist from New York, whose social circle included Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover, converted his zeal for Aryan supremacy into helping enact a series of American immigration and marriage restrictions in the 1920s, as the Nazi Party was forming across the Atlantic. Grant went far beyond Southern segregationists in his contempt for marginalized people. He argued that inferior stocks should be sterilized and quarantined in a rigid system of elimination of those who are weak or unfit or perhaps worthless race types. Grant published a rabid manifesto for cleansing the gene pool of undesirables in his 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, the German edition of which held a special place in the Fuhrer's library. Hitler wrote Grant a personal note of gratitude and said, "This book is my Bible." Hitler had studied America from afar, both envying and admiring it, and attributed its achievements to its Aryan stock. He praised the country's near genocide of Native Americans and the exiling to reservations of those who had survived. He was pleased that the United States had, quote, shot down the millions of redskins to a few 100,000, end quote. He saw the United States Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 as a model for his program of racial purification, historian Jonathan Spiro wrote. The Nazis were impressed by the American custom of lynching its subordinate caste of African Americans, having become aware of the ritual torture and mutilations that typically accompanied them. Hitler especially marveled at the American knack for maintaining an air of robust innocence in the wake of mass death. By the time that Hitler rose to power, the United States was not just a country with racism, Whitman the Yale scholar wrote. It was the leading racist jurisdiction, so much so that even Nazi Germany looked to America for inspiration. The Nazis recognized the parallels, even if many Americans did not. Thus, on that day in June 1934, as 17 Reich bureaucrats and legal scholars began to deliberate what would become unprecedented legislation for Germany, they were scrutinizing the United States, and they had done their homework. One of the men, Heinrich Krieger, had studied law in the American South as an exchange student at the University of Arkansas. He had written extensively about foreign race regimes, having spent 2 years in South Africa, and was at that very moment completing a book that would be titled Race Law in the United States, to be published in Germany 2 years hence. The Nazi lawyers had researched U.S. jurisprudence well enough to know that, from the fugitive slave cases to Plessy versus Ferguson and beyond, the American Supreme Court entertains briefs from southern states whose arguments were indistinguishable from those of the Nazis. In their search for prototypes, the Nazis had looked into white dominated countries such as Australia and South Africa, but there were no other models for miscegenation law that the Nazis could find in the world, Whitman wrote. Their overwhelming interest was in the classic example, and that was the United States of America. These 17 men were convening at a time of intrigue and upheaval in a country descending into dictatorship. The Nazis were in the final throes of consolidating their power after their takeover the year before. Hitler had been sworn in as chancellor, but was not yet the Fuhrer. That would not happen until later that summer, in August 1934, when the death of Germany's ailing president, Paul von Hindenburg, the last holdover of the Weimar regime, cleared the way for Hitler to seize total control. Hitler had made it to the chancellery in a brokered deal that conservative elites agreed to only because they were convinced that they could hold him in check and make use of him for their own political aims. They underestimated his cunning and overestimated his base of support, which had been the very reason they had felt they needed him in the first place. At the height of their power at the polls, the Nazis never pulled the majority they coveted and drew only 38% of the vote in the country's last free and fair election at the onset of their 12-year reign. The old guard did not foresee and chose not to see that his actual mission was to exploit the methods of democracy and to destroy democracy. By the time they recognized their fatal miscalculation, it was too late. Hitler had risen as an outside agitator, a cult figure enamored of pageantry and rallies with parades of people carrying torches that an observer said looked like rivers of fire. Hitler saw himself as the voice of the Volk, of their grievances and fears, especially those in the rural districts, as a God-chosen savior, running on instinct. He had never held elected office before. As soon as he was sworn in as chancellor, the Nazis unfurled their swastikas, a Sanskrit symbol linking them to their Aryan roots, and began to close in on the Jews. They stoked ancient resentments that dated back to the Middle Ages, but that rose again when the Jews were made the scapegoats of Germany's loss and humiliation at the end of World War I. Seen as dormant in banking and finance, Jews were blamed for the insufficient financial support of the war effort, although historians now widely acknowledge that Germany lost on the battlefield and not solely for lack of funds. Still, Nazi propaganda worked to turn Germans against Jewish citizens. Nazi thugs taunted and beat up Jews in the streets and any Aryans who were found to be in relationships with them. The regime began restricting Jews from working in government or in high status professions like medicine or the law, fields that incited jealousy among ordinary Germans who could not afford the expensive cars and villas on the lake that many successful Jews had acquired. This was the middle of the Great Depression, and more than a third of Germans were out of work in 1933, the year the Nazis came to power. The Jews' prestige and wealth were seen as above the station of a group of Nazis decreed were beneath the Aryans. Mindful of appearances beyond their borders, for the time being at least, the Nazis wondered how the United States had managed to turn its racial hierarchy into rigid law, yet retain such a sterling reputation on the world stage. They noticed that in the United States, when it came to the racial prohibitions, public opinion accepted them as natural. And that was written by historian Claudia Kuntz. A young Nazi intellectual named Herbert Kyer was tasked with compiling a table of U.S. race laws and was confounded by the length to which America went to segregate its population. He made note that by law in most southern states, white children and colored children are sent to different schools, and that most states further demand that race be given on birth certificates, licenses, and on death certificates. He discovered that many American states even go so far as to require by statute segregated facilities for coloreds and whites in waiting rooms, train cars, sleeping cars, street cars, buses, steamboats, and even in prisons and jails. In Arkansas, he noted, the tax rolls were segregated. Whoa. He later remarked that given the fundamental proposition of the equality of everything that bears a human countenance, it is all the more astonishing how extensive race legislation is in the United States. Here was one of several Nazi researchers who thought American law went overboard. With the results of their research laid out before them, the men at the June meeting began debating two main pathways to their version of caste system. The first, creating a legal definition for the categories of Jews and Aryans, and second, prohibiting intermarriage between the two. Germany had looked at America's miscegenation laws decades before and tested its own intermarriage ban at the turn of the 20th century when it forbade its settlers to mix with indigenous people in its colonies in Southwest Africa. In doing so, Germany went further than most colonial powers, but it did not come close to the American model. Now, Nazi extremists pushed for ways to prevent any further penetration of Jewish blood into the body of the German folk. As the debate got underway, Krieger, the former University of Arkansas law student, reported that Americans had gone so far as to make interracial marriage a crime punishable by as much as 10 years imprisonment in many jurisdictions. He pointed out that the United States had divided its population in two with artificial line drawing between white people and colored people. He and other Nazis showed a fascination with the American habit of assigning humans to categories by fractions of perceived ancestry. There is a growing tendency in judicial practice, Krieger said, to assign a person to a group of colors whenever there is even a trace of visible Negro physical features. The men who gathered for that meeting did not agree on how much to draw from American jurisprudence. The moderates at the table, among them the chair himself, Franz Gertner, argued for less onerous methods than the Americans were using. He suggested that he suggested that education and enlightenment about the perils of race mixing might be enough to discourage Aryans from intermarrying with others. At one point, he sought to downplay the U.S. prototype because he had a hard time believing that Americans actually enforced the laws the Nazis had uncovered. Gertner simply refused to concede that the Americans actually went so far as to prosecute misogynists. Oh, misogynist, I'm sorry. One of the hardliners at the table, the Nazi radical Roland Freisler, was impatient with the pace of the proceedings. He had joined the Nazi Party back in the 1920s and was pushing for a law to punish Jews and Aryans for racial treason if they intermarry. Time and again, he and the other extremists in the room brought the discussion back to the American statutes, explained and defended them, and tried to convince the skeptics. How have they gone about doing this? Chrysler asked at one point, breaking down his research into the United States and its law of human classification. The Americans, he explained, used a range of motley parameters to separate white people from everyone else. One state, he said, classified as non white any and all persons from Africa, Korea, or Malaysia. In another example, he said, Nevada speaks of Ethiopians or of the black race, Malaysians or of the brown race, Mongols or of the yellow race. Chrysler argued that the overlapping contradictions could work to their advantage. The tangle of American definitions lent a measure of latitude and a useful inconsistency for the task of human division. The Americans had come up with a definition of race apart from logic or science, an approach that Friesler called the political construction of race. Wow. What the Nazis could not understand, however, was why, in America, the Jews who are also of interest to us are not reckoned among the colored. When it was so obvious to the Nazis that Jews were a separate race, and when America had already shown some aversion by imposing quotas on Jewish immigration. Aside from what, to the Nazis, was a single vexing omission, this jurisprudence would suit us perfectly. I am of the opinion that we need to proceed with the same primitivity that is used by these American states, he said. Such a procedure would be crude, but it would suffice. The doubters continued to question the American statutes, but when they went back and forth on exactly how a marriage ban would work, parsed the proposed definitions of Jew and Aryan, tried to make sense of the American fraction system. Moderates were disturbed by the idea that people who were half Jewish and half Aryan would be cut off from their Aryan side and deprived of caste privileges they would otherwise be accorded. Rather than defining such people as half Jewish, the skeptics wondered, would they not also be half Aryan? But one hardliner, Akim Girk, referred back to the prototype they had been studying. He proposed a definition of 1/16 Jewish for classification of Jews because he did not wish to be less rigorous than the Americans. Shit. The men debated for 10 hours that day and ended without agreement. We have been talking past one another, Friesler frustrated by, we have been talking past one another, Friesler, frustrated by the lack of progress, said toward the end. The moderates had managed, for now, to contain the radicals who had pushed for the American prototype. But 15 months later, the radicals would prevail. In September 1935, Hitler summoned the Reichstag to the annual Nazi rally in Nuremberg to announce new legislation that had been incubating since the Nazi takeover. By then, Hitler had either imprisoned or killed many of his political opponents, including the murders of 12 members of the Reichstag and of his longtime friend, Ernest Röhm, the head of a Nazi paramilitary unit, the SA. All of this rendered the Reichstag a puppet arm of the government, having been intimidated into submission. At that very moment, the Nazis were building concentration camps all over the country. One was soon to be opened in Sachsenhausen, north of the Reich capital, and would become one of their showcases. The plan was to announce legislation, ultimately known as the Blood Laws, on the final day of the rally. The night before, Hitler directed a small group of deputies to draft a version for him to deliver to the Reichstag to rubber stamp it. The Nazi researchers had come across a provision in some of the United States miscegenation laws that could help them define whether a person who was half Jewish should count as a Jew or an Aryan. It turned out that Texas and North Carolina had an association clause in their marriage bans that helped those states decide if an ambiguous person was black or white, privileged or disfavored. Such a person would be counted in the disfavored group if they had been married to or had been known to associate with people in the disfavored group, thus defying caste purity. This is North Carolina and Texas. Y'all need to check out y'all's state constitution. This was what Hitler announced that September and expanded in the months to come. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor defined a Jew as a person with 3 Jewish grandparents. It also counted as Jewish anyone descended from 2 Jewish grandparents and who practiced Judaism or was accepted into the Jewish community or was married to a Jew in line with the Americans Association Clause. Again, that's North Carolina and Texas especially. Secondly, the law banned marriage and intercourse outside of marriage between Jews and Germans, and it forbade German women under 45 to work in a Jewish household. Thus began a campaign of ever-tightening restrictions. Jews were henceforth stripped of citizenship, prohibited from displaying the German flag, and denied passports. With that announcement, Germany became a full-fledged racist regime. The historian George Frederickson wrote, American laws were the main foreign precedents for such legislation. But given the Nazis' own fixation on race, the American prototype had its limits. The scholars who see parallels between the American and Nazi racial classification schemes are to that extent wrong, but only because they understate the relative severity of American law, Whitman said. As cataclysmic as the Nuremberg laws were, the Nazis had not gone as far with the legislation as their research into America had taken them. What did not gain traction on the day of the closed-door session or in the final version of the Nuremberg laws was one aspect of the American system. While Nazis praised the American commitment to legislating racial purity, they could not abide the unforgiving hardness under which an American man or woman who has even a drop of Negro blood in their veins counted as blacks, Whitman wrote. The one-drop rule was too harsh for Nazis. Well, this book is challenging for me to read because I'm envisioning Elizabeth Wilkerson is making me see in my mind's eye what's happening. But people, pay attention. Please listen to yesterday's and today's reading and talk about it with your family. Say 21, I'm out.